A truly traumatic week in the U.S. From a bombing at the Boston Marathon to tainted mail in Washington, D.C. Nerves are frayed, and the country is on a heightened state of alert. So how is all of this affecting the security here? Could we experience actually a ripple effect? Our political panel is poised to weigh in on this in Ottawa. Freelance columnist Susan Riley, Rob Russo, Ottawa bureau chief with the Canadian Press. So, Rob, when something like this happens, a shudder is felt in all capitals because we all feel that kind of trauma and vulnerability. But for Canada in particular, is there a ripple effect that moves across the border? Is there a heightened state of alert in this country and possible talk of tightening the border?
Yeah, I think it was automatic that there was a sort of heightened vigilance at the border. It was I think, gratifying for a lot of people who were around in 9/11 to see that things didn't completely come to a halt at the border.
Right.
You know that Canadian officials were mindful, however, of the rumors that were started after 9/11 that some of the 9/11 bombers came into the United States from Canada that turned out to be myth. That myth endured in the United States and still endures in pockets of Congress sometimes. So Canadian officials were determined, given the proximity of Boston to the Canadian border, to guard against any possibility of a flight into Canada. It's 4 hours from Boston to the Canadian border. So you wanted to make sure that didn't happen. So they were mindful of that. The other thing that was important, I think, was that there wasn't necessarily a ripple. There was probably a prequel effect to what was happening in Boston because of what happened in London and what we've discovered about what happened in London, Ontario over the last few weeks.
Right.
It just brings to mind exactly what the risk is now for Canadians and for other people in Western countries, is that the threat is no longer people who are training in dusty bases in the middle of nowhere, in some country forgotten by God in many ways. It's now the threat is homegrown. The threat is people who are inspired by organizations like Al-Qaeda. That's the threat, and we've got to be vigilant against it.
So, Susan, let's talk more about the political reaction and the debate that was triggered by the events in Boston. A lot of it, of course, from Justin Trudeau and his comments about trying to understand the root causes of terrorism and the dust-up that triggered with Stephen Harper. Did Justin Trudeau put himself in a vulnerable situation politically by saying that?
I don't think so at all. In fact, if anything, I think he probably garnered sympathy because of the extreme nature of the reaction, especially from the Prime Minister. I thought Mr. Trudeau offered some fairly harmless, perhaps unoriginal comments. He displayed normal human curiosity about the cause of these events. Excuse me, at the time he was speaking, he made it clear that, we didn't know at that point who the bombers were or what their motivation was. Totally normal human observations, in my view. And then we have a Prime Minister, breaking from Margaret Thatcher's funeral in London, sounding, truculent, incurious, and in fact dishonest in the way he characterized Mr. Trudeau's remarks. I thought it was totally shameful, his behavior. Number two, the NDP, then they piled on. They agreed with the Prime Minister that Mr. Trudeau was somehow excusing or exonerating terrorism, which is nonsense. And here's the NDP, the party of Alexa McDonough, of Ed Broadbent, of, a party that is, of all the parties, extremely sensitive to the complexity of these issues. And I just thought it was, both of those parties looked disgraceful. And Mr. Trudeau, of course, there are going to be questions still about his abilities and his motives and whatnot. But I thought you couldn't help feeling sympathy for him.
But, Rob, the remarks were viewed as controversial outside of just partisan politics. Is the controversy not so much what he said, but in a way the timing, that he reflected on that point in the immediate aftermath of the bombings?
Yeah, I can tell you, we used to do some seminars for young reporters, and I would always tell them, use your powers of observation to report what you know, what you see, what you hear, and not beyond that. I think Mr. Trudeau went beyond that in trying to ascribe motive to the terrorists before he knew anything. That was a mistake. I think he wandered into real trouble, though, when he said, there is no question, I think those were his words, there is no question that these people felt excluded. In effect, he seemed to be trying to shift some of the blame for what happened to the fact that these people might have felt isolated. I think that was a mistake. Did the Prime Minister politicize it? Yes. I mean, the Prime Minister has an unerring instinct for an exposed jugular, but that jugular was exposed by Mr. Trudeau. We'll know for sure whether or not he felt like that was a mistake. If he uses those words again, that there is no question that these people felt excluded. If he uses that again, then okay, fine.
Right.
It's not a mistake.
Yeah,
I'd be very surprised if he uses those words again.
But I'm not scandalized by those words, Rob. I mean, it turns out that Mr. Trudeau was prescient, as a matter of fact, because it looks... And we should make a distinction, a clear distinction. It's obvious to everybody, to me, that by trying to understand what happens, by grasping at insight, you're not excusing what happened. I mean, that to me is so obvious that I think this whole criticism is really blown up.
Understanding? Absolutely. You've got to try and figure out why this happened. But to ascribe that motive, that they felt excluded when one of them was married to an American and had an American child, at the same time he was saying, I have no American friends, I think puts Mr. Trudeau in a difficult position.
We may actually hear more, obviously, from the leaders because, you know, just at the end of this week, surprise announcement that there will be debate on the government's anti-terrorism bill starting on Monday. What's this all about, Susan? I mean, is this in response and wanting to have a full review in light of the Boston bombings, or is this something else completely different?
I think that's the pretext.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure how useful this exercise is going to be, and I'm not quite sure how many lessons are easily transported across the border. I mean, terrorism today is a complicated... We've just already discussed that. What this was is an attempt to preempt a motion from Mr. Trudeau's Liberals, which would have allowed backbench MPs more freedom to speak in the House of Commons. And he was hoping, Mr. Trudeau and his very clever organizers were hoping to kind of force a wedge into the Conservative caucus, because we know that a lot of Conservative MPs have been feeling very restive under Mr. Harper's iron grip. So I mean, the Liberals had their motive. They were mischief-making, but so did the Conservatives.
So what do you think, Rob? I mean, is this an opportunity for constructive debate about a front-of-mind issue right now, or is it political evasion?
Sadly, Nancy, constructive debate has been elusive in the House of Commons for a long, long time. I would welcome it in this instance. I don't think that this is what it's about at all.
Okay.
I do think that this is a warning, though, to those Conservatives who are about to garner some support or maybe make common cause with the Liberals. I think the Prime Minister is also trying to say, if you make common cause with these people, you will be lumped in with these people, and we're going to show you, or we're going to try to show you, portray what these people are like that you're trying to make common cause with. It's a shot across the bow of his own people as well.
Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. We're going to pause, but coming up, next federal election, of course, over 2 years away, but the party's already getting into campaign mindset. Both the NDP and Liberals have their sights on Quebec. How big of a battle is brewing in that province? Our panel is back to explain after the break. Stay with us.